I need to talk to you about something that happened in Las Vegas this week, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it because I think honesty matters more than highlight reel enthusiasm right now. Day 2 of mandatory minicamp put both Fernando Mendoza and O'Connell in front of the actual starting defense for the first time, and what came out of that session isn't something you can just brush aside if you're genuinely trying to understand where this team stands heading into camp. Let me walk you through exactly how this unfolded. Kirk Cousins was not running with the first group during those team periods. Instead, it was Mendoza and O'Connell splitting the majority of those reps, going head-to-head against a defense that's been completely rebuilt under a brand new first-year coordinator. And I'll say this up front, I actually love that decision from a developmental standpoint. Mendoza is nowhere close to being this team's Week 1 starter, and honestly, he's not even part of that real conversation right now. That's not an insult to him. That's just where he sits on his timeline. But throwing him into live reps against a real aggressive first-team defense, even without pads, is exactly the kind of pressure test a young quarterback needs if he's ever going to be ready for whatever role this organization eventually hands him. So no, I'm not bothered that he got those reps. What does give me pause is how those reps actually played out on the field. Mendoza's accuracy took a noticeable step back from what people were watching him do just one day earlier, and that matters specifically because of who he was lined up against. The day before, he was carving up a defense full of backups and roster bubble guys fighting for a final spot. This time, he stepped into the deep end against the players actually projected to start come September, and the difference showed up almost instantly. He took 2 sacks in that session, one from Malcolm Kuntz coming off the edge clean, and another from J.J. Pegues collapsing the pocket straight up the middle. Now, before anyone runs off and starts writing Mendoza's NFL eulogy after a single practice, I want to be fair here. Jumping from third-string competition to a sharpened, disguised, multiple-look starting defense is an enormous leap in difficulty, and there's no tape on this new scheme for the offense to study beforehand. They're walking into every single rep essentially blind. I get that completely, and anyone reacting like this with some kind of disaster needs to take a breath and slow down. But here's where the easy explanations start to lose their grip, and I think we need to actually sit in this moment instead of rushing past it. O'Connell wasn't exactly sharp either, and O'Connell isn't a rookie still finding his footing in this league. He's entering year 4. At some point, it's early stops being a fully satisfying excuse because this league doesn't really care how long you've had to adjust. It only cares whether you're producing when the moment calls for it. I'm not pulling any fire alarms here, and you shouldn't either, but I also refuse to pretend this was some clean, reassuring day for the quarterback room just because the calendar still says June. It wasn't a disaster. It also wasn't comforting. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and I think that's exactly the tension we need to hold on to right now. Then there's the interception, and honestly, out of everything that happened in that entire session, this is the moment that tells you the most about where this team's real identity is heading. O'Connell launched a deep ball downfield toward Philip Dorsett, the kind of 50-50 jump ball you actually want your quarterback testing in a setting like this, because how else are you supposed to find out whether your guy can climb the ladder and win a contested catch in tight coverage? You don't learn that by running safe checkdowns all camp long. So I have zero issue with O'Connell letting that one fly downfield. The real story belongs to the other side of the football because it was rookie safety Dalton Johnson who came down with the interception. Now, there's a legitimate case to be made that he got away with some contact that might have drawn a flag in a real regular season game, and I'm not going to pretend that debate doesn't exist. But set the officiating argument aside for 1 second and just watch the raw instinct on display. A rookie defensive back fighting through traffic, attacking the football at its absolute highest point instead of playing it safe and protecting his positioning. That's exactly the kind of aggression a coaching staff dreams of seeing from a young player clawing for a real roster spot, and I think it's the first real hint of what's about to become the genuine headline of this entire camp. Because the moment you shift your attention away from the quarterbacks and onto the defense, this entire story flips on its head completely. This is where things get legitimately exciting, and I don't think nearly enough people are framing it the right way yet. Start with the pressure up front. Both sacks on Mendoza, Kuntz off the edge and Pegues through the interior, weren't isolated flashes you can write off as luck. They're confirmation of something I've believed for a while now, which is that Malcolm Kuntz has the kind of ceiling that can single-handedly transform an entire pass rush room if he stays healthy and puts it all together this year. And Pegues is the true wild card in this whole equation, the kind of interior defender whose career trajectory could genuinely break in either direction. But the raw traits jump off the tape if you're watching closely enough. Lock both of those names into memory, because I have a strong feeling they're going to matter a lot more by November than they currently do in June. Now let's get into Key Walker, because what he said after practice might be the single most important storyline buried inside this entire camp report. Walker admitted that he's never before in his career been asked to line up inside, outside, in the slot, and on the line of scrimmage, all within the same defensive structure. Stop and think about what that actually does to an offense trying to prepare for this unit. If you can't identify pre-snap whether a player is dropping into coverage, crashing off the edge, or filling an interior gap, you're not just dealing with talented individuals anymore. You're dealing with structural chaos built by design. This mirrors the same defensive philosophy that's made Seattle so disruptive, with Mike Macdonald's fingerprints all over that approach. You take athletic, versatile pieces and you scramble the picture before the snap even happens, forcing the quarterback to process uncertainty instead of pattern recognition. That's not a minor scheme tweak. That's an entirely different way of asking your players to think about football. And if Rob Leonard pulls this off in year one, opposing coordinators are going to have a miserable time preparing for this defense all season long. And it's not isolated to Walker either. According to reporting circulating out of camp, Jeremy Chin and Taron Johnson are both being rotated through multiple positions as well. And once you start connecting these dots, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Chin has reportedly been working at both slot corner and safety. Taron Johnson, who plenty of us assumed was locked into a pure slot corner role the moment he signed, has also been logging safety reps. Even Eric Stokes has been bouncing between different spots in the secondary. I know there's going to be resistance to this from purists who want their slot corner to stay a slot corner and nothing else, and that's a fair instinct. Specialization absolutely has its advantages. But this coaching staff clearly believes in something different, and I think the responsible move right now is giving that vision actual room to develop before anyone rushes to pass final judgment on it. There's a name I don't think is getting nearly enough attention yet, and that's Cody Lindenberg. With Nico Dean sidelined and away from practice, Lindenberg has been the guy consistently working alongside the first-team defense, and I don't think that's some meaningless scheduling footnote. That tells you he's currently ahead of the other options at that position. And if anything happened to either starting linebacker right now, he's the next man up without a moment's hesitation from the staff. Build-wise, Lindenberg actually profiles closer to Key Walker physically than he does to Dean, but in a defense designed around interchangeable pieces and matchup versatility instead of rigid size-based roles. That stops being some kind of disqualifying factor. It might have been under a more traditional system. The priority here is putting your two most disruptive linebackers on the field at the same time, regardless of whether their frames fit a stereotype. And I respect that approach. Remember Lindenberg's name heading into camp. And then there's Hezekiah Massey, someone I've genuinely been excited about for a while now, and watching him keep stacking first-team reps throughout this camp only adds fuel to that excitement. No pads yet, sure, that part is real and worth acknowledging honestly. But these players are running full speed, fighting for real position on every single snap, and when somebody keeps separating himself in that kind of environment, I don't think you get to shrug it off as meaningless until August rolls around. History actually backs this up. Max Crosby was already piling up close to double-digit sacks during his rookie season, despite limited early playing time, because elite traits show up early no matter how buried a guy looks on the depth chart. I remember watching Malcolm Kuntz's very first preseason snaps against Jacksonville and immediately sensing there was something different about how explosively he got off the ball. That's usually how it goes with the real ones. They don't wait for brighter lights to start showing you what they actually are. I'm not writing off Darian Porter in this competition either. He's got every opportunity to carve out his own role. But right now, rep after rep, it's Massey putting his name at the front of that conversation. And that's exactly the kind of development worth tracking closely as camp approaches. I also think it's worth pausing on what this quarterback situation actually reveals heading into the season, because the real story here isn't about Mendoza or O'Connell as individuals. It's about what their performance this week says about the depth sitting behind Kirk Cousins, and depth behind a 30-something veteran quarterback is precisely the kind of thing that quietly decides entire seasons. Every team loves talking up its starter in June. Almost nobody wants to honestly confront what happens if that starter goes down for even a handful of weeks, and this week gave us a small, uncomfortable preview of exactly what that scenario might look like. I'm not suggesting either of these guys is incapable of stepping in and competing if his number gets called. I'm saying the margin for error in that hypothetical just became a little clearer, and uncomfortable clarity is worth more to me than comfortable assumptions that have never actually been tested. There's also a fairness argument worth making on Mendoza's behalf before anyone writes him off based on a single rough session. Rookie quarterbacks drafted into a backup or developmental role almost never get this much national attention during minicamp. The fact that his reps, his accuracy, his sacks are being tracked and dissected this closely tells you something about the expectations already attached to his name, fair or not. That's the cost of being a notable draft pick at this position. Every single rep gets magnified. Every miss gets picked apart, long before he's even expected to be ready for a meaningful role. That context matters if we're going to talk about this honestly, instead of just reacting to a stat line in isolation. Now flip back to the defensive side, because there's a deeper strategic layer buried in everything Rob Leonard is building that goes beyond simply confusing blockers before the snap. A defense built around interchangeable roles isn't just harder to read, it's harder to scheme against week after week, because opposing coordinators can't just study last week's tape and assume the same players will show up in the same spots again. Every single game becomes its own unique puzzle for the offense trying to prepare. That's an enormous schematic advantage if the personnel can actually execute it at a high level. And based on everything coming out of these early sessions, with Walker, Chin, and Taron Johnson all comfortably sliding between roles, the early signs suggest this group has the football intelligence to actually pull it off. That's the difference between a gimmick package and a real defensive identity, and I think this unit is trending firmly toward the latter. Jackson Powers Johnson sat out part of practice the day before, and almost immediately people online jumped to wildly dramatic season-ending conclusions off a single non-padded minicamp absence. That kind of overreaction was always going to look foolish in hindsight, and sure enough, he was back out there the next day working with the first unit, looking completely fine. Powers Johnson is entering year 3, and the tape on him has been impressive enough that his spot up front looks about as secure as anything on this entire roster. Combine that with Colton Miller anchoring left tackle and Tyler Linderbaum holding down center, and a couple of these offensive line battles already feel like settled business before training camp has even truly begun. The right guard competition appears to be trending in that same stable direction. On the offensive side more broadly, a couple of smaller details buried in the practice tape are worth flagging because they hint at bigger plans ahead. Mendoza was working from both shotgun and under center throughout the session, which tells you the staff isn't trying to simplify his reads or box his development into a single style of operation. They're developing him as a complete quarterback, even if his immediate role this season ends up limited. And there's one more detail that genuinely caught my eye watching the route concepts unfold. Jalen Naylor and Brock Bowers were running strikingly similar concepts out of the slot. Quick game stuff, bubble screens, the kind of packaged plays designed to get the ball out fast and let your skill players win in open space. I want to be careful here and label this as speculation, because it is, but it's the kind of speculation I find genuinely compelling. If both of those guys are drawing nearly identical assignments out of that slot alignment, it suggests the coaching staff might be planning to feature both of them heavily this season, possibly interchanging who lines up as the Z receiver depending on personnel and matchup. Maybe it amounts to nothing more than scripting coincidence, but when the same pattern repeats itself across multiple sessions, I don't think it's unreasonable to start connecting that to something intentional. One last trend worth zooming out on before wrapping this up, because it speaks to where this entire offense seems to be heading philosophically. Running backs across the league have become a far bigger part of the passing game than they used to be, and the teams executing that well right now, the ones built around motion, play action, and backfield deception, are consistently the hardest offenses in football to defend. Look at what Seattle, San Francisco, and the Rams have built over recent seasons. If the early signals out of this camp suggest the Raiders are building toward that same identity, layering in more movement and more unpredictability into how the ball leaves the backfield, that's a genuinely exciting structural shift, not just a cosmetic one. So, where does that leave us after 2 days of mandatory minicamp? The quarterback room handed us a reality check worth sitting with, honestly, instead of explaining away entirely, but the defense gave us something that feels like the actual identity of this team forming in real time right in front of us. Versatility up front, disguised looks across the secondary, young players like Lindenberg and Massey forcing their way into the conversation through pure effort and raw instinct rather than draft pedigree alone. That's the version of this team I'm going to be watching closely as camp gets underway, because if that defensive identity holds up once the pads finally come on, this could end up being a far more disruptive unit than anyone outside that building was expecting heading into the season.